All right, we're good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll open with a story. On October 27th, 1917, there was open fighting and really war going on the streets of Moscow. And what had happened was that Bolshevik revolutionary forces were engaged in combat with pro-government military cadets, and they were battling for control of the Kremlin. And while this battle for Moscow's enormous fortress compound was going on, there was another battle that was also waging at the exact same time. And it was raging in the diocesan house of Moscow, which was just 2 miles away from where the fighting was going on. There, more than 500 churchmen and hierarchs had gathered at a sacred council of the Orthodox Church of Russia to debate whether or not they should restore the ancient office of the Patriarchate. And this had been abolished by Tsar Peter the Great over 200 years prior in the year 1700. And the participants who had come, many of whom had had to detour hundreds of miles just to get around the battle line so that they could be there, they had not come of one mind. And there was real debate going on. There were numerous clergy who were there who were arguing passionately that a revived patriarchate was a bad idea because this would threaten the conciliar rule of the Russian church. They were very, very worried about that. At the same time, monarchy had just been overthrown in the country itself. And so to them, the idea of, okay, we've overthrown monarchy, so let's now elevate a single sort of hierarch to be the figurehead of the church, they were worried about what that might do in terms of provoking the Bolsheviks. At the same time, there were others who were arguing the counter side, that a revived patriarchate is what would actually revive and be good for the church's independence. And probably more forcibly, what they were arguing is, given all the chaos and turmoil that was going on in Russia, the political unrest, and all of the opposition to the church that was going on, they said, we need a leader. We need a unifying figure to bring us together. There was one bishop in particular at the council who said, Russia is aflame. Everyone is dying. Who cannot now say that we need an instrument for gathering and uniting Russia? When there is a war, a leader is needed, without whom the army is in utter disarray. And this is the argument that carries the day, ultimately, at the council. On October 31st, the council votes to reinstall or restore the Patriarchate. And then, kind of like firecrackers on a string, a whole string of events begins to happen. On November 3rd, the Bolsheviks took the Kremlin. And on November 5th, Tikhon, who was at that time the Metropolitan of Moscow, was elected to step into the office. Or I shouldn't say elected, and I'll explain why eventually when we come to that. But he is selected to step into the office of Patriarch of the Orthodox Church of Russia. And almost immediately, the Bolshevik government, having taken the Kremlin, begins to viciously wage war on the Russian church. And for the next 8 years, until Tikhon dies in the year 1925, Tikhon is the focal point of that fight. All right, he is the one that the Orthodox faithful, more than anyone else, looked to as their champion, as their leader. The faithful loved him, they adored him, they flocked to him in droves, and they looked to him as the one who will lead them in the midst of these chaotic times. How do we relate and live the faith in the midst of this time when the government is seeking the very destruction of our church? And the Bolshevik government as well. They train their sights on him because to them, he is their greatest enemy. And they are convinced, Trotsky, Lenin, that discrediting or removing Tikhon is the key to breaking the back of the Russian church. And they set their sights on doing that. And for the next 8 years, what he had to endure was terrible. He is placed under house arrest 3 different times. He's subjected to constant harassment by the government and secret agents, constant interrogations, some would say torture. He faces an internal coup that comes up within in the church that's orchestrated by government agents with the aim of trying to divide the church and oust him. He's slandered in the state-run press on an almost daily basis. And he watches as thousands of the clergy and the laity for whom he is their spiritual father and for whose spiritual care he is responsible, as they are arrested, publicly tried, and in vast cases are exiled and executed. This is what he has to deal with. And while he's dealing with all of this, he's shouldering the burden of trying to resurrect this traditional role of the patriarch in societal and political conditions that it had never encountered before, that are hostile to its very existence. And he has to try to chart a course for negotiating how the Russian church can even still exist within this formal atheist regime. There was no playbook for anything that he was facing. There's no blueprint for anything that he has to come up against. And one of the things that you see when you get into what he faced in those 8 years is it's not a situation where oftentimes he's presented with a sort of array of options and he has to choose between good and bad. There are times where all he has to choose from is bad and worse. And he's a tremendous example of the struggle to live faithfully in the midst of chaos and in the midst of intense opposition. He's also an incredible example of what it is to live humbly and of what it is to live and to be kind to people. He's an incredibly decent man. That can seem like such a patronizing thing to say. He was a very decent person. But Tikhon was an incredibly decent man when you get into his life. And so with that as our introduction, that's what I want to do. Let's get into his life and walk through it. He was born Vasily Ivanovich Balavin on January 31st, 1865, to Yoan and Anna Balavin in the town of Klin, which, as you can see, is on the far western edge of Russia. It was a very, very small village. His father was priest at the Resurrection Church, or the Church of the Resurrection there in Klin. His father before him had also been a priest. You can see there a picture, the top picture is actually the Church of the Resurrection and what that looks like today. Although it has been somewhat restored, it was destroyed during the Bolshevik Revolution as well, or at least it was severely damaged. It is still the same exterior structure. In 1869, Yoan was transferred to the slightly larger town of Toropets, which was about 220 miles further to the west. It was a very idyllic town built on a lake, still very, very beautiful today, and it had a population of 5,000 at the time, and it was a town that was dominated by churches. In this town of 5,000, there were more than 50 Orthodox churches. Think about a ratio like that. That's a church-to-people ratio of like 1 to 100. That would be like in the city of Wichita, there being 3,500 Orthodox churches. Like that's the ratio that exists. It was a very, very devout town, and it still is so to this very day, although sadly, of all the churches, all but 12 of them were destroyed after the time of the Bolsheviks. Vasily was the third of 4 brothers, and the other 3 all died young. He was the only one who lived past the age of 32. He entered seminary at the age of 13 in the Pskov Seminary in 1878 to prepare for the priesthood. And the way preparing for the priesthood went, by the way, that is a picture on the upper corner of the Pskov Seminary as it would have looked around the time he was a student there in the 1880s. And the way that training for the priesthood worked was typically you went into seminary and you trained for 6 years. Usually it was from ages 14 to 20, although he goes in a year early because of his academic advancement, so he goes in at the age of 13. And after 6 years of training, you would then be ordained and then become a parish priest. Interesting for the community here at St. George, the dean of the Pskov Seminary for the first 3 years that he was there was a Syrian from the Antiochian church, a man named Archimandrite Gerasim. And a small number of the students at a seminary, the ones who showed academic promise, would be selected to go on to one of the 4 theological academies for more rigorous academic training. And these men usually went on to become, most of them went on to become ordained, but they also would go on to become seminary professors or professors at the academies themselves. Many of them, if they took the monastic path, became bishops, all right? And there is a picture of the St. Petersburg Theological Academy, which is where Vasily was sent at the age of 19. It looks very much the same now as it would have looked while he was there. from the stories that are told of him while he was at St. Petersburg, that's really where we get our first glimpses on what he was like as a person and our first glimpses of his character and his personality. There's very little written of him, about him from his earlier life. When he arrives at St. Petersburg, he encounters a student body that is incredibly polarized, all right? There were, on one side, there's a number of very young, very, very charismatic faculty who were advocating for a movement at the time called the learned monasticism. And this was a sort of reform movement that was from a sort of ultra-conservative side. And what their goal was to renew the church hierarchy through a combination of rigorous academic education combined with a monastic vocation and a very strict asceticism and a far more rigid application of the church canons. And sort of the goal was, let's get young men to embark early on the monastic path, and then we can fast track them into positions of the episcopate, positions of leadership, and we can change the church more quickly. And there was a real foothold that this learned monasticism, as it was called, had at the St. Petersburg Academy when Vasily arrived there. And then you have on the other side, besides this ultra-conservative faction, there was this sort of ultra-leftist faction which had taken place there as well, who were very, very taken with the anti-institutionalist and especially the anti-monastic ideas of like Leo Tolstoy, the Russian novelist, and were also very much reading the ideas of Karl Marx. And Vasily is unique and is distinguished in that when he gets there, according to all the memoirs of his classmates, who later oftentimes wrote about him, he's distinguished in that he kind of shuns either pole. In the words of one of his classmates, he, quote, sought a path that was solidly orthodox while seeking to avoid extremism of either side. And he really earns a lot of his classmates' respect for this. And this is going to be a theme that plays out in his life, this sort of pursuing a solidly orthodox path that is averse to ideological extremism of either the right or the left. He actually gets nicknamed, while he's a student there, Patriarch, by his classmates. And this is not a joke. They give him this nickname out of respect. And it's not it's not like anyone had any idea that he might eventually become the Patriarch. I mean, the Patriarch at that point had been abolished for 180 plus years, so it's not even something that's on anybody's radar. And many of his classmates later on, when he becomes Patriarch, like they remind him of this. This was your nickname, and this was like a prophetic nickname that had been given to him. He was also a very, very popular student. There are stories told by his classmates about how the students would frequently gather in his room, and that while they were there, these sort of impromptu liturgical practice services, as it were, would spring up, with Vasily singing and leading them in the singing of Vespers and other liturgical services, and that sometimes this went on for hours, and that this was a very popular activity among the students there. He graduates in the year 1888, fifth in his class out of 56 in the spring. Now, typically after graduation, students would immediately embark on either the path of the married priesthood or into celibate monasticism. And like I said, due to the presence of this learned monastic movement, there was a very large contingent of students who were taking that path. And already before they graduate, they're headed down this path because they know it's a path to faster, climbing the ladder, as it were, in the church. Vasily, when he graduates, does neither. Rather, he returns to the Pskov seminary to teach, and he teaches there for 3.5 years. Before finally, in December of 1891, he takes his monastic vows. And he's tonsured as Tikhon, after St. Tikhon of Zadonsk. And it's a move that catches his old classmates off guard. None of them see this coming. Like, he had never been pegged as one heading down the monastic route. And they tell him this, like in letters at the time, like, how did this happen? Why are you taking this route? And in part, that's because initially he hadn't planned on it. He had planned to be a married priest. And this is something that in a lot of the published stuff in English, I didn't find. And but one of the things that we know is that early in his career at the Theological Academy. He had actually been involved in a relationship with a young woman from his hometown in Toropets. Her name was Maria, and they had become engaged. And his plan was that after graduation, he would become a priest, and they would be married, and he would enter into that life. But what happened was, at some point when he returned home for the summer time, it was either second or third year of the academy, not really sure which, he found that she had taken up with another man, and actually the man who was the brother of her brother-in-law. And so within the canonical situation of the time, it was actually an illicit relationship, so they couldn't legally be married, and she had become pregnant. And so the relationship ended, and the woman eventually Maria had 8 children with the man that she remained with, and one of the daughters-in-law, who had married one of her sons, spoke with a Russian historian many years later and talked about this. And she told a story about how years later, many years later, after which Tikhon was a bishop, he had returned home to Toropets to visit, and Maria had seen him, and she had tried to get away before he could see her, but wasn't successful. And Tikhon sees her and approaches her, and she doesn't really know what to do. She feels ashamed. And so she just simply attempts to go into prostrate before him, and Tikhon wouldn't allow it. He raised her back up, and he just simply looked at her and smiled and said, "Are you happy, Masha?" Which was what her nickname was. And she couldn't do anything but just weep and put her face in her hands. And he blessed her with the sign of the cross over her, and then departed. And I like that story because oftentimes when we get into talking about the lives of the saints, it can become sort of a litany of just one great miracle or one great deed after another. And it's a unique sort of glimpse into a very personal side of St. Tikhon and of his life. And that's one of the reasons I like that story. But anyways, he takes the monastic path. In a letter to a classmate at the time who's asking, like, what are you doing? He actually tells him that he had begun thinking about the monastic path late in his career at the academy, but he explains in this letter why he waited. He says, "I did not dare to yet take the tonsure because I first wanted to test myself. I dare say that if I were to have taken the tonsure immediately after graduating, I would, like the other young monks, have been given a commanding post, despite my lack of experience. And in most cases, this seemed to me to be accompanied by a certain amount of harm, both to individuals and to the work itself. To use the monastic rank in order to gain prestige is a betrayal of the monastic vocation." So you see this very measured and thoughtful kind of approach that he has to things. Well, from there, he's made dean of the seminary, Orthodox seminary in Kholm. Kholm at that point was at the far western border of Russia. It's now the city of Kelm in Poland. And it was a far more religiously diverse town than any that he had ever encountered. There was, being Poland, a very, very large population of Jews that were there. There was a large population of Roman Catholics and Eastern Catholics as well. And one of the things about Tikhon's time there is that he builds this reputation as being very much the Orthodox people's leader. I mean, he's an Orthodox man and he's their leader, but at the same time, he's able to build very, very good relationships with the other religious communities that are there, such that they really, really respect him. And when eventually he leaves Kholm, there were a number of Jewish rabbis who expressed their dismay. Why are we losing such a good man? He was so good to us, and who express, their respect for him. And it's largely because of this sort of skill he has that in 1897, at the age of 32, he is made bishop of Lublin, which is the diocese in which he's already resident in Kholm. He stays living in Kholm even after he's made bishop. And his consecration speech, which was not pre-written. This is a thing about Tikhon. He liked to speak extemporaneously. He rarely wrote his speeches out. And as a result, we don't have as many speeches and sermons of his as we do of many other people who are his contemporaries. It was only if it was recorded and transcribed, or if there was somebody there who transcribed it, that we actually have a lot of his speeches. And there was someone there for his consecration speech, and it turned out to be rather prophetic. He said, "When I was young, serving as a bishop seemed to me to be honor, reverence, power, and authority. But now I understand that the episcopate is above all ascetical action, labor, and effort. The true life of a bishop is a constant dying from cares, weaknesses, and sorrows. And again, that last sentence, very, very much prophetic of what would await him, especially in his time as patriarch. And this would probably be a good time to talk a little bit about Tikhon as a person. He was very much a people person. He was a gregarious guy. He liked people. He liked to talk to people. There are legion stories from wherever he is as a bishop, whether it's here in Russia, whether it's in America when he goes back and he's patriarch, of him being up till the small hours of the morning, drinking tea with guests and just talking with them in his residence. He loved to talk with people. He had an incredible sense of humor. There were American journalists who later on meet him who are very enamored of this. Like, he does not fit the mold of the stereotypical, like, stern Russian that they have, you know, because of his jovial personality that he has. He was not a dominating personality. He was very, very calm. Everybody talked about that, how even-keeled he was, and how not given to being tossed about by just overarching winds of things. And they also talk about his blue eyes. He had incredibly bright blue eyes. One American journalist who met him said, "A firm hand clasp and kindly eyes with a decided trace of humor, and his beaming smile, these are your first impressions of the man." This is a picture of him much later on, but I like it because I think you can see that personality in that picture. I love that picture of him. It's one of my favorite ones that I've found. You see that sense of his character in it. He avoided many of the airs that bishops put on. That was another thing that everywhere he went, people talked about. When he was in Culm, he would typically walk to the parishes that he visited. You know, he didn't like being driven around. He hated when he was the patriarch that they made him be driven in a car or in a carriage someplace. He thought that was ostentatious. Later on, when he's in America, he takes public transportation. And there's a San Francisco newspaper that at one time is reporting about just the strangeness of this guy who is the bishop of all the Orthodox churches in America, and how he's riding on the train in the public cars, and how strange it is to, you know, in the American public cars, here's this guy with a big beard, long hair, and this cassock, you know, sitting there in the public service cars, riding to wherever it is that he's going to, the church that he's going to visit. Maybe the best testament to his personality was an account written by a man named Metropolitan Yevlogy, who wrote this in a memoir that was only recently, in 2014, translated into English and published by St. Vlad's Press. And Yevlogy was a bishop of Culm, or the bishop was made bishop of Lublin several years after Tikhon was gone. And he writes in his memoir about how his habit was, when he would go to churches, is that he would always go through the priest's diary. Now, that's not like the priest's personal diary. This was a journal that the priest was expected to keep at the church of all the liturgical services that had been performed. And also anytime any dignitaries or bishops came into town and what their services that they performed was. And he writes of how in one small parish, he came across an entry from where Tikhon had visited this parish. And it lists his visit, and it lists the liturgical services that he performed. And the priest had appended a small note that he had not ever appended any notes to anywhere else. But the priest had appended a small note noting Tikhon's visit, and had simply written, "For the first time in my life, I see a hierarch who is a human being." And this was something, again, later on in 1906, he goes to consecrate a church in Butte, Montana. And a person who attends the consecration, who writes about it in the local newspaper, writes of him, "We saw before us not a bishop, but a person as well." So the same thing, the same sentiment expressed. So this was Tikhon. In 1898, he was appointed as bishop for the Diocese of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, which includes the territory of Alaska, all of Canada, and the whole lower 48. So he's got a 10 million square mile diocese that he gets handed in 1898. A couple of pictures of him from round about that time. He arrives in New York City in November of 1898. He's met at the ship dock by Father Raphael Halloweeny. We know St. Raphael of Brooklyn, whose icon is there in the sanctuary. That's who meets him at the dock. And the American Orthodox community at this point was scattered. It was not very well organized. In the official welcome speech that he is given when he arrives, he is told, "There are many wild branches in the vineyard which the Lord has made your lot." So he's saddled with this Herculean task of trying to gather the American church together, try to get it up on its feet. Most of the large cities at the time did not have sufficient church buildings. A vast number of the faithful Orthodox were meeting in homes still at this time. And the Episcopal see that he's given is in San Francisco. And what he would do is essentially spend 6 months out of his year traveling. After Pascha, he would hit the road, and he would go all the way across to the eastern border of the United States. Then he'd work his way all the way back, and that was 1 year. Then the next year after Pascha, he goes across the whole of Canada, comes all the way back to Seattle, catches a boat, goes up to Alaska, and back down. Rinse and repeat every other year. That's the work he has ahead of him. And in Alaska and Canada in particular, the traveling was rough. I mean, he wrote of being caught in gales in the northern seas at times. He traveled regularly by kayak when he was in Alaska and Canada to areas that were inaccessible by the roads or by rail. In one letter, he writes back home in 1904 of how he was kayaking up the Yukon River and how he, quote, fought a bloody but losing battle with mosquitoes. And he would bring a tent with him everywhere that he went because oftentimes it was days of travel in between settlements. And you had to sleep out in the wild. And travel was only by horseback or by carriage. And on one trip to Canada in 1899, he wrote of how descending a hill, his carriage was jostled and he was thrown from it and the back wheel of the carriage ran him over. And so they had to pick him up. They get him back into the carriage. They can't patch him up until he gets to the town. They finally patch him up, and then he gets up and he goes and he serves the liturgy that same day. This is a tough guy. Like, this is something, the more you read and the more you get into the stories of his life, this is a tough, tough man. And it was exhausting work for him, though, because he spread so thin over so much here in America, and he is constantly writing to the Holy Synod back in Russia, requesting more priests be sent, more teachers, more catechists. Please send us more money. He begs them to appoint an assistant bishop for him who can stay in San Francisco so that he can move the main Episcopal see to New York City, because that's where the bulk of the immigrants are coming in. The Orthodox immigrants are coming into New York City. And almost to a one, his letters are either delayed in being given responses or they're just ignored by the Holy See entirely. And finally, in 1902, his younger brother, Mikhail, who was his last surviving brother and who had come with him over to America to serve as sort of his personal assistant, dies suddenly. And this is a real severe blow to him. It's a hard blow. And he petitions Moscow to be allowed to accompany his brother's body back home for burial, and they grant him permission. And in letters that he writes from the time, it's absolutely clear that he indicates that once he gets back to Russia, he doesn't want to come back to America. He is burnt out, and he's going to petition them to let him stay. And to just reassign him somewhere else. It's very clear that that's what he intends to do when he gets home. But once he returns and he sees to his brother, he ends up getting re-inspired to return to America. But he goes to the Holy Synod and he gives them an ultimatum. He says, okay, you give me an assistant bishop or I am not going back, because there's nobody else they can send. I mean, he's already the bishop. So he's like, you give me a bishop or I'm not going back. And so they agree to send one, but he's cagey about it, okay? He refuses to leave and go back until they've appointed the bishop and the guy is with him and they go back together. He's like, I'm not going back until I have this guy in my pocket. And this totally re-energizes his work in America. He moves to New York City and he oversees the building of St. Nicholas Cathedral there, which is there on the right that you see. That's the same constructed building that he oversaw the building of. He also oversees the expansion of the Orthodox Seminary, small Orthodox seminary that existed there in Minneapolis, and to train resident clergy. This is a big deal to him. He really wants to see the American Orthodox Church train its own clergy rather than just bring them in from overseas. He establishes the first Orthodox monastery In North America, St. Tikhon's Monastery in Pennsylvania, named for his patron. Those are two early pictures of it. He also oversees the creation of the first Orthodox service book in English. That's a first edition title page from that particular book. Another thing which is very important to him, to see Orthodoxy grow in English. He wants to see the liturgy have the opportunity to develop in English here as well. He worked on that with a woman named Isabel Hapgood. She was the primary translator, and she was an Episcopalian, and that's just something that I will mention. He developed very, very close ties with the Episcopalian community while he was here. This is, in fact, before I was assigned to do St. Tikhon, the only thing I knew about St. Tikhon was his, being a former Episcopalian, was his involvement with the Episcopalians. But this is a picture of him where he actually went to the ordination of an Episcopal bishop and just was there as an observer. He's there on the far right, and there were actually three other members of the Russian church who went with him. St. John Kukurev, St. Sebastian Dubovich, and St. Tikhon. So all three of the Russian delegates who were there to observe in the stands, as it were, went on to become saints. That's a pretty good gallery, there to pretty good gallery to have there. In 1904, he consecrates St. Raphael to be Bishop of Brooklyn to oversee the Syrian Orthodox Church there. There's a picture of him with Bishop Innocent, the other bishop, there in the middle. And this is really a part of the vision that he has, and that he talks a lot about in his writings back home at the time, that he wants to see bishops appointed who will oversee the various ethnic communities of Orthodoxy that are there in America, who could function as sort of sub-dioceses under the larger sort of archdiocese of the Russian Church. And because of the mix of traditions that exist there, he actually writes the Russian Church back home and says, you need to take a more hands-off approach and leave the American church alone because of the kind of unique situation here. And he really has this vision of this ultimately leading, he writes about, to autocephaly for the American church. And he spearheads the organization of what's come to be called the First All-American Orthodox Council in January of 1907. And this vision that he has for sort of the structure of the American church and the organization of American Orthodoxy is one of the key things that he's planning to take up at this particular council to try to hammer out. Unfortunately, right before the council, like weeks before the council, the Holy Synod decides to transfer him back to Russia after 9 years. And what this does, he still goes to the council, but this just totally chops the legs out from underneath of him because he can't push for any change because everybody knows he's leaving, so who's going to lead this thing? And so this vision that he kind of had never really gets developed. But in January 1907, he goes back to Russia. He's made Bishop of Yaroslavl, where he will remain until 1913. And this, judging by his letters, this is the happiest time of his life. He loves Yaroslavl. It's a beautiful, beautiful town, beautiful area, and the people there loved him. He shocked people when he arrived by announcing to them, like, if you want a blessing and you come up to me, he said, don't kneel or prostrate. And they were like, they had never met a bishop who had said such a thing. But again, you see this sort of unostentatious way that he had about him. He would arrive at churches, again, on foot. If he showed up in a carriage, he drove it himself most of the time. He liked to get up in the church bell towers. And in Russia, the bell towers were oftentimes separate structures. You can see a picture of one there in the cathedral from around the time that he was there. He loved to get up in there and to check on the bells and to help make repairs if anything needed to be repaired on. He's transferred in 1913 to become the Bishop of Vilnius, which is actually now part of the country of Lithuania. And he serves in that post until June 1917. And this encompasses the time, actually, of World War I. Vilnius was very, very close to the front and is eventually overtaken. He has to evacuate. And Tikhon was incredibly active among the soldiers during World War I, frequently visiting the trenches. You can see that in that picture right there on the right. I love that picture of him with the troops there